All right, the label switched to live there, up there in the corner. So this means that we are now recording. So what I can say is welcome to the Fane of Fantasy. This channel is all about giving you inspiration to master your craft and create fantasy that will truly immerse your audience. So today I'm joined by Nicholas, and it's a very, very early morning session for Nicholas. So I hope you've had your morning coffee, but welcome to Fane of Fantasy, Nicholas.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here. Again, my name is Nicholas McGurr. Been writing books now for about 20 years. I'm a little different than maybe some of your other fans and other guests that you've had, as in the fantasy that I write about is all about the afterlife. And I write about death. You know, it's one of those things where it's the great unknown. So it falls into that fantasy category because nobody truly has the answers. So I battled a little bit with genre, when I was getting started, but, I found that, my biggest fans came from science fiction and the fantasy world. So I'm really happy to be here to talk to your listeners.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I have some, the realm of the dead in some of my books as well. So I'm looking forward to getting into all of this. That's very cool. So we were gonna to talk today about knowing how you get to know who your audience are. Some stuff about researching, and also how to reveal the rules of our world as necessary when we are writing. So where do you want to start with all of this, Nicholas?
Well, I guess I kind of already segued into, getting to know your audience and learning what your genre is. I talk to a lot of new authors, and, as soon as any one of us mentions that we're a writer, people want to say, well, what do you publish? What do you write about? And that's usually a main question we're all here. So when I say I write about death, it's not always, that dark and gloomy, horror story where I thought I was going to fall into. But it's one of those. I'm sorry, I just woke my dog up, so it's early morning here in the States. So if you hear him barking in the background, my apologies. But knowing your audience is, I really sent my book out to a lot of beta readers, and getting to know their feedback and what they were going to give to me. And the more I started listening to them, it's a big deal. When you send your book out to a bunch of beta readers, and when I say beta readers, it's not family and friends. They're going to say everything's great and everything's cheery, but you really go out and seek these people out. There's plenty of on Goodreads and other websites you can join to get beta readers, and getting to know what they are telling you. And if they tell you something's a little off, you should really take that into consideration. These are the fans. These are the ones that are going to be buying your books. So, that's, again, I can't say it enough how big of a deal it is to know what genre you fall in and knowing who your audience truly is. My writing has completely changed, over the past 20 years because of that. So I thought I was going to be the literature or / horror writer, and it turns out I'm more sci-fi fantasy, and that's who I pertain to now.
Right. And then when you say that you started out by saying that what you write is a bit differently than most, in that you're writing about death and all that. But so did you do any kind of research on similar books as yours and try to find people who read those sorts of books? Or how did you go about locating these beta readers, in the sense that you knew that these people would understand the genre, so to speak? It's pretty easy in my view to find beta readers, but often you can risk finding somebody who's simply not used to reading it. So the advice that they would be giving would be off track, basically.
I'll be honest, this was not a genre I even wanted to fall into. I'm a classic lover. I love classic literature. And I was reading all the greats, Dracula and all of that, as far as horror went. And I really thought I was going to fall into the horror genre. But when I did the research on, who's reading these books, it was a matter of my first book that I wrote was, entailed with Greek mythology. So that automatically started grabbing those sci-fi readers and seeing if I was accurate. They were testing, my knowledge of was I really going after this? And again, I deal with death. So it wasn't about Zeus and all the happy gods. It was all about Hades and what, evolves around that realm. So when I started realizing what my theme was with every story I was writing, it was more sci-fi fantasy, and that's what my beta readers were telling me.
So yeah, well, Hades is my favorite one of the Greek gods anyways, so that's cool.
Right?
But maybe I don't know, maybe, or you can correct me here, but maybe it's so that most people who read either sci-fi fantasy will, you know, maybe you just fall slot into that genre and category anyway. Is it so?
It's really odd, and again, I thought it was going to be that dark doom, doom and gloom type mentality, and it just kind of evolved into something else. And the stories that I write now, they're more based on death, in the afterlife itself. So I know a lot of your watchers and listeners, based on the sci-fi fantasy reader, they're more of that. They're probably used to that, more of that Tolkien type mentality. And I know you're huge on maps, but a lot of my fantasy is based on real world type places. It's obviously things take place here in the States. I use Ohio, the state of Ohio, a lot because that's where I'm from. I write the location that I know about. I live in South Carolina now. So some of my stories kind of hinder on the South Carolina border, but there's no real fantasy world. Like, it's not an entire universe built somewhere in a land far, far away. I go after that mystical universe where it takes place also here on Earth. So again, I write differently, and again, in dealing with death, it's one of those, there's so many different religions around the world that have their different spins on death. So I have to kind of make it half real world and half mystical world.
Right. Yeah. So if I was just thinking still in the line of knowing your audience and that stuff. So do you have any good advice on how people can go about understanding who their audience really are and basically, let's say, almost researching? I was about to use that word, but
I guess the best way, I mean, if you're going to, and I made the mistake, like I started writing about what I was passionate about before I really went after a genre. I would say read a lot of what is already in the genre that you're looking to fall into. So obviously if you're into sci-fi fantasy, read a lot of sci-fi fantasy and read a lot of different types of sci-fi and fantasy, because sometimes those two don't intermix. Sometimes it's either just sci-fi or just fantasy. So if you're looking to intermix it, read a broad range. That's the best advice I can give. I spent years trying to figure out where I was going to fall into, and I wasted a lot of time of a lot of good stories I could have been writing if I would have fell into the right genre early on in my career.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And at the same time, I always argue as well that you should always be writing what you're really passionate about. Because if, at least for me, if I don't, it just becomes a day job, so to speak.
Sure.
I want to write stuff that I'm really excited about. And but of course, it is important from a sales and marketing point of view to understand where you belong, so you can target or maybe angle the story towards the readers and your audience.
Yeah, and that way, not to say we're all competing against each other, but you need to know where you're falling on those rankings on the websites of where your books are sold. So, I mean, obviously, if you've gone national or international, you want to know, like, who's beating you? Why are they gaining more sales? So you want to learn from that person. Like, that's the big thing is knowing who your competitors are, or, fellow writers, so that way you can see what they're doing and what they're doing right. So that way you can almost mimic that. And even if it's just a marketing strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And with all the millions and millions and millions of books on Amazon,
there's not millions of books out there.
You really need to know how to target. Yeah, that's absolutely sure.
So, I mean, and I want to kind of jump into researching more, and it deals more, I guess, with researching, what you're writing about. I talked earlier about, some Greek mythology things that, I've intermixed with mine, and then a little bit of religion and places, for example. I've written a story once where I had never been to the location. And, looking into that, I had to dive into the lexicon and the slang terms of that location to make sure all of the things that I was reading were correct. And going back to my beta readers, it was more of all right, let me look for people that live in this location to make sure like I'm using the right terms, am I accurate? And you will learn a whole lot, especially if you're using slang terms of something that's deep in the South or very prominent in their heritage and culture. So beta readers are such a big deal, especially when you are sending books out and it's not published yet. You're putting yourself out there, and it's obviously a big risk, but you're going to learn so much from those people that send you that feedback. I can't tell you how important beta readers are. You know, researching is not going to do you any good if the people that are going to read it aren't going to like your work, or if it's inaccurate, you're going to lose credibility real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because I listened to a lot of podcasts, and I think it was within the last week or two or something. There was a writer. He's not fantasy writer, but he was writing thrillers, also set in the real world, and he explained how he uses Google Earth to zoom down on street level, so he could pan the camera and see what it looks like, so he could write it. And he said that actually he often gets feedback of people believing that he's actually been to the countries he's writing about, because he gets it so correct. Yes. But it's absolutely true. If you don't, it's going to hurt you, and that's kind of that's where I'm lucky, because I just write in complete fictional world. So I just make it up as I go there. So I have that advantage.
And I've done the exact same thing with the Google Maps. One of my stories takes place in New Orleans, so I had never been there. And I literally use Google Maps to zoom in on the streets and look at the buildings and see what the people are dressed there, because Google Maps, they have people in their photos. Yeah. So I mean, you take a look around and you see what's going on down in cities that you've never even been to before. It's wonderful. We live in a great day and age where technology can help the writer so much, and I can't tell you how great it is. It was wonderful to do that.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Technology has turned us writers into spies.
So I guess some of the other things, the other topics we talked about were, obviously researching, knowing your audience, and releasing rules about your world that you're building. So, and I wanted to talk about this because I read so many books that are from new indie authors. It's their first book, or they're so excited to get into the hands of another writer to get some opinion. And at that turn, I'm their beta reader. So I read so much where they are revealing too much at the very beginning, right? And I'm sure you've seen this yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Where all of a sudden, 10, 15, 20 chapters later, you have to remember whatever that rule was that they created, that, the spear can only be released from the stone at this time of day. So you don't remember that. So you have to kind of release that information, very slowly. You don't want to overwhelm your readers. You don't want to portray too much that you've built this giant world, and you need to know, the world before you dive into the characters. The characters need to interact with that world. So until a rule is needed, it's not really necessary to put it into the book until it's actually needed. Of course, if it's a little too late where somebody's pulled the sword from the stone and then you realize it was stuck afterwards, that's obviously bad timing. So, and I use that because, of course, Sword in the Stone is, I'm sure, a sci-fi fantasy lover's dream. I love that story.
Yeah.
But releasing that information is detrimental, and really do your research when you're reading other books and seeing how they release information. I recently read a book where the book released information, but then kind of told a myth from that world after the fact. So it was a little odd setup for me, because I'm so used to hearing about what a rule is of that world before the actual happening. So this was released after the happening, and I felt it very odd, and it was kind of choppy in the writing. I won't release the book that I read because I don't want to, downplay any other authors, but it was very odd to read it that way. So really, if you're writing a book and you have these rules to your world of the way things work, it's detrimental of where you put it. Its placement is key, and how you put it is key. So make the rules up, of course, before your story, but know when to release them so that the reader doesn't get confused or overwhelmed. That's a big key.
Yeah, indeed. Well, essentially, this is basically what we call info dumping, right? When you have this half a page or even full chapters of information about this world and how everything works, or it could be magic systems as well and whatnot. And on one hand, it's incredibly boring to read. It's like, yeah, okay, but something needs. I would like something to happen here other than just a long encyclopedia about how the rules are, about the sword in the stone and how you get it out and whatnot. pretty boring. But the other thing I think is it's always important to keep up the tension. And if you look at it in the way that you look at the situation through the lens of the character, being the character being the lens on through which you look upon the situation, the character wouldn't stand around thinking about, I know that there is a sword in a stone somewhere, and basically these are the ways that you can get it out, unless there is a situation occurring whereby that conversation makes sense, if you see what I mean, right?
I see exactly what you mean. So when you're releasing information like that, that info dumping is a key term. And I hear that, I listen to a lot of podcasts just like you. And info dumping is, they warn against it all the time. And I'll tell you, the first story I wrote, I did exactly that. I info dumped, and it was just filler page after filler page and I started repeating myself. So it was more of I wasn't releasing the information when it needed to be read. So the beta readers, and I'll be honest with you, I have this book still published as a reminder of how far I've come.
Right.
I feel it's a horrible story, but it's just a reminder. It does sit on my bookshelf with all of the books that I've ever written, but it's info dump, info dump, info dump. And it's a warning for all new writers is to, if it doesn't make sense where it's at, either move it or get rid of it. One of those kill your darlings, as I'm sure somebody else has probably said on your show before.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the heart of it, the problem is that with fantasy, especially if you're because we're writing things that are not real, then you have a situation where you do need to explain things, and that's what makes it so hard, especially when you're dealing with fantasy. Because if you're writing a thriller, you don't have to start explaining what a car does and how a car works. But if there is a similar to a car in a fantasy setting, you actually do need to explain how it works and why and so forth. But so the trick is to find ways to do it as and when relevant, as you said before, that when he gets into the car, then you can explain what it is and how it works, because then it makes sense. But even still, then you need to make sure you don't overdo it. Just a sentence or two is probably enough, and then the reader can fill in the blanks.
Yeah, all that filler space and those filler pages can be overwhelming for a reader, and they're going to put your book down. And it's not only if it's at the beginning, but if it's in the middle and you're trying to explain what a car is and how it works, we already know that. We're just explaining it on a different world's point of view. So it's all about perspective at that point as well. It's a good point.
Yeah, indeed. And it also comes a bit from the inheritance we already, all of us have, from Tolkien and so forth. I mean, back in the day when C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and those guys were writing books, it was also, to loop back to the conversation about audience, it was a different audience. People read books in a different way back then. Back then, it was fine to have long descriptions about something, or Robert Jordan with The Wheel of Time is the same thing. Long descriptions, up and down pages about this and that. Whereas today's audiences, we live with Netflix and HBO and Hulu and all that stuff, and we need some action. We need something to happen. It needs to be exciting. Otherwise, there's better things to do with our lives. And that's kind of the challenge we have as authors in today's day and age.
And even now, like I have a book I'm working on, and it hasn't hit the beta readers yet, other than one. And of course, the feedback I got was, when is this going to happen? When is that going to happen? Because in the blurb of the book, it explains that this is what the book is about. So I realized at the beginning I had probably a little too much filler space and a little too much explanation. So I had to kind of take some out or move it around to where it was more relevant in the story, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, because it was, you're constantly learning, as a writer, that you have to change things up. So those beta readers and learning what that feedback is and does is going to be huge for your next book. So I cannot wait to release this next book. It's going to be so good.
Yeah, and isn't that kind of the wonder of the wonderful thing about writing, is that you'll never become a master at it. You can always improve, and every time you look back at a previous book, then it'll be worse than the newer. So it's kind of an endless evolution of your writing skills, which is, I think you should just look at it as that's a wonderful thing. You can always become better. That's great.
It's the undying imposter syndrome, because your new book is always better than your last.
Yes.
It's like, oh, what was I talking about when I wrote this book? So I completely understand.
Yeah, indeed. Okay. Is there more in terms of research or revealing your world's rules as necessary, or that you would like to cover before we round off, Nicholas?
I guess some of the things about research, I mean, that's one of the favorite parts that I love about writing is not only do I read a lot about the topic that I'm about to write about. And of course, the old adage that you need to write what you know, right? So we all kind of like, hey, we found this passion. I like this, and then of course you need to turn into that subject matter expert and do all of the research. I went as far once when I was working on a title. It was about an alcoholic. I don't drink a drop of alcohol. So I literally went to AA meetings, Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, to learn more about alcoholism and to speak with former alcoholics to get those emotions, to get those feelings, to get, all of that research in, and that's kind of the fun part of our job. A lot of people are like, oh, you write books, you sit at a computer all day or, with your notebooks. No, I'm out in the field. I do my research. And of course, I had to keep my theme of death. I just needed a new type of character. And the type of character I was building happened to be an alcoholic. So I actually had to research that more in depth because I don't drink. So there was that one aspect that I didn't know about. And like you said, we are always ever evolving with what we do. So that's the fun part about researching. So I would say to any advice of new writers, don't just sit at your keyboard. Go out into the field, learn more about what you need to learn about. I write about death. I visit a lot of cemeteries. I keep the inspiration there. It's a constant flow and it's a new cemetery all the time. So again, that's just a bit of advice that I'd like to throw out there for new writers. It's not always about sitting at your keyboard. Go learn something more.
Yeah, and I think even that advice applies to those watching who are not writing, but maybe are just doing world building for whatever other games or whatever they might use it for. The same thing applies in terms of if you need some inspiration to make your cemetery different, go out visiting some and try to not copy what they look like, but just take in the inspiration and see what your mind can twist it into in some interesting way. I think that's sound advice.
Good deal.
Okay, cool, Nicholas. So if people want to know more about your writing and what you're up to and stuff like that, where can they go to find more about you?
You can find all of my works on Amazon. Barnes & Noble is another obviously major website, but right now I focus on Amazon. So all of my works are on Amazon in ebook format. All of my ebooks currently are 99 cents. And then of course they're available in paperback as well.
Cool. Very good. And I will ask Nicholas to give me some links so I can add them into the description field for you guys. So if you want to check him out, you can just go to the description field and it will be right down there. So thank you so much for joining today, Nicholas. It was great talking to you, even though it was an extremely early morning slot for you.
It's okay. I'd love to do it again.
Cool. Very good. So thank you so much for watching. And as you know, you can support this channel on Patreon as well. You can just check the link again down in the description field below. It's all there. So all there is left to say is thank you so much for watching. Stay safe out there and see you next Monday.